Thomas Granger had always known the value of silence. Not the kind that came from solitude, though he had plenty of that, but the deep, patient silence of the land itself, the kind that whispered through the pines and rolled across the hills in the late afternoon wind. His 1,500-acre ranch sat like a forgotten kingdom on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, a small town nestled at the edge of the Appalachians. The town had grown over the years, sprouting subdivisions and strip malls like weeds in the once wild earth. But Thomas's land remained untouched, wild, and resolute. It had been his family's for over a century, passed down from father to son like a sacred trust. The Granger land wasn't just dirt and trees, it was history. There were old stone fences built by his grandfather's hands, worn trails made by cattle long since gone, and a barn that leaned like it had stories to tell. A wide creek wound through the northern stretch, fed by mountain runoff and home to trout fattened on insects in the summer. Every acre bore a memory: the old sugar maple where Thomas carved his initials as a boy, the grove where his father taught him to shoot, the field where his mother used to hang linens in the spring breeze. This wasn't land you simply owned. This was land that owned you, demanded your respect, and gave back only what you earned. Thomas lived simply in a modest ranch house built by his father after the war, 3 bedrooms, hardwood floors, and a front porch that faced the sunrise. He had no wife, no children. Just a few aging horses, 2 border collies named Red and Whiskey, and the land that filled his days and shaped his life. He'd had offers over the years, developers who called with bright eyes and bigger wallets, promising to elevate the value of his property. He always laughed them off. "You can't pave over roots," he'd say, tipping his hat. That all changed on a Tuesday morning in early October. The envelope came in the mail like any other, a nondescript manila rectangle with no return address, just his name printed in cold, black ink. He nearly tossed it with the junk mail, but something about the weight of it made him pause. Inside was a letter from the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. At first glance, it looked like a mistake. It referenced Subdivision 6B, parcel zoning, and a series of legal clauses Thomas didn't recognize. He read it again. And then again. Each time his brow furrowed deeper, the blood draining from his face. According to the document, Thomas's land had been annexed under a Pine Ridge zoning statute he'd never heard of. The entire 1,500 acres, it claimed, had been legally subdivided and reclassified for residential development. The letter informed him that his property had been sold to several new residents as part of a community development expansion effective 3 months ago. He was advised to vacate any structures and cease interference with construction or homeowner activity. Attached were copies of the so-called transaction records, complete with scanned signatures, his own, apparently, on sales agreements he'd never seen before. He read the letter a 4th time, heart-pounding, mouth dry. Then, in a flash of anger and disbelief, he threw on his coat, stuffed the papers into his satchel, and climbed into his battered Ford pickup. The county recorder's office was an hour's drive down the highway, nestled between the courthouse and the tax assessor's office in a squat gray building that looked more like a DMV than a keeper of justice. Thomas walked through the doors with the quiet fury of a man who had just seen ghosts. The clerk behind the counter, a nervous young woman with glasses too big for her face, looked up as he approached. "I need to speak with someone about land records," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Of course," she said, forcing a professional smile. "Do you have a property ID or name?" "Granger Ranch. Parcel block 11 through 18, southwest of the county line." She typed into her terminal. After a few seconds, her fingers slowed. Her face changed. It looks like the ownership was transferred 3 months ago. To the Pine Ridge Development Initiative. Is that not correct?" "No," Thomas said flatly. "It's not. I never sold a damn thing." She blinked, confused. "But your name is on the filings." "Here, these were notarized." Thomas leaned over the desk, scanning the digital screen. There it was. A PDF with a signature block bearing his name, dated 3 months ago. He stared at it, stunned. It wasn't his handwriting. Not even close. "I want to see the original documents," he said. She hesitated. I'll have to get my supervisor." 20 minutes later, an older man in a tweed blazer arrived with a tablet and a folder thick with legal papers. He shook Thomas's hand and introduced himself as Harold Simmons, the deputy county assessor. He led Thomas to a small conference room and spread the documents on the table like a dealer laying down a hand of cards. "I can see why you're upset, Mr. Granger," Simmons said. "But everything seems to be in order, at least on paper. These contracts are fully notarized." The land was annexed under Ordinance 74A, which permits the transfer of non-residential land bordering existing residential zones for community expansion, assuming no formal objections were filed. You signed these forms? No, I didn't, Thomas interrupted. This is forgery. Simmons frowned. The signature matches your ID, sir. No, it doesn't, Thomas said. He pulled out his driver's license and placed it beside the document. The difference was obvious. Simmons looked down and his mouth drew into a tight line. This shouldn't have passed review, he admitted. But it did. Who filed the annexation? The Pine Ridge HOA. Specifically, Beverly Keene, president of the board. Thomas exhaled slowly. He knew that name. Beverly had been a loud, persistent thorn in Pine Ridge politics for years. A woman with a silver tongue and a nose for real estate schemes. She'd pushed through more zoning changes in the past decade than the town had seen in a century. Always under the banner of modernization. Always with a developer's checkbook in her purse. She bribed someone, Thomas said. Simmons looked uneasy. I can't comment on that. Thomas stood, gathering the documents. Then you better tell me who can. He left the office with a copy of every record he could get. As he stepped outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. In the distance, he could hear the hum of engines, the clatter of construction. He followed the noise. Just past the eastern ridge of his land, where thick woods once stood, were now rows of foundation frames. Orange fencing, bulldozers, stacks of plywood and concrete rebar. Dozens of workers moved across the site like ants on spilled sugar. Signs read Valley Haven Estates, starting at $900,000. His land, his trees, his sky, and he was nowhere in it. The day after Thomas Granger discovered that his family's land had been stolen out from under him, a storm rolled in from the west. Not a storm of rain or wind, but a quieter, more dangerous kind, a storm of silence. Thomas didn't rage. He didn't scream. He didn't march into town with fists flying or make dramatic speeches to the press. No, Thomas Granger went silent, cold, calculating, and deadly still, because silence was a Granger trait. It was how his grandfather hunted deer, how his father dealt with trespassers, and how Thomas himself had always dealt with things that needed fixing. You didn't shout at a broken fence, you got a hammer. You didn't cry over dead cattle, you dug holes. So when they stole his land, his heritage, Thomas didn't go to war. He started collecting tools. The first tool was information. He converted his dining room into a war room. Maps covered the table, red pins marking every lot number involved in the development known as Valley Haven Estates. Legal documents, purchase records, HOA filings, all tacked to the walls, annotated in red marker. He ran strings between pins like it was a crime scene, which, of course, it was. He didn't own a computer more modern than a 10-year-old laptop, but he bought a new one and learned fast. By the end of the week, he had downloaded land records from the county registrar's database, business filings from the state attorney's office, and tax assessments from the municipal portal. He bought printer ink by the case. What started as curiosity quickly spiraled into a rabbit hole. The annexation of his land hadn't been a simple misfiling or rogue act. It had been methodically planned. The Pine Ridge HOA, led by none other than Beverly Keene, had filed a motion to expand their jurisdiction under Ordinance 74A, an obscure municipal clause from the 1970s. The ordinance allowed an HOA to absorb unincorporated land adjacent to their boundaries, provided they had the implied or express consent of at least 51% of neighboring property owners. But Thomas had never given consent. Someone had given it for him. He pulled the form from the scanned records. There it was, his signature forged in black ink. Not just his, but also those of 6 other landowners along the outer edge of the HOA. Most were elderly farmers or absentee landlords. Some had passed away. Some didn't even live in the county anymore. All were listed as having agreed to annexation. It was a fraud, a carefully crafted, legally framed fraud. Still, Thomas needed more than suspicion. He needed proof. So he hired Geneva Rook, a private investigator from Raleigh known for exposing white-collar corruption. She looked like a librarian and swore like a sailor. Geneva arrived on the ranch in a battered Jeep with a duffel bag full of scanners. encrypted drives, and a .38 revolver. She listened to Thomas's story, looked through his files, and nodded once. "Someone forged your life," she said simply. "Let's unforge it." Over the next 2 months, they hunted in tandem. Geneva tracked paper trails, emails between HOA board members, wire transfers from a shell development firm called Valley Ridge Partners, and mortgage loans processed months before the annexation was finalized. She identified patterns. Names that appeared on documents, signatures with odd spacing, a notary public who seemed to sign every form within the same 2-hour window. Meanwhile, Thomas focused on the land. He rode out in his pickup and began visiting the properties surrounding the newly built development. The new homes gleamed like parasites on a dying animal. Bright siding, clean driveways, perfectly squared lawns. But what Thomas cared about were the cracks in the foundation, figuratively and literally. He visited the Meacham property to the west. Old Jim Meacham had moved to a nursing home in Tennessee. No way he signed anything in Pine Ridge. Thomas called the home's director. Jim had been under 24-hour care and hadn't written anything in over a year. Another fraud. Then the Landry farm, sold 2 years ago to a developer who, curiously, had also donated heavily to Beverly Keene's re-election campaign for HOA president. It was all a web, and at its center was Beverly. Geneva tracked down Caleb Price, a disgruntled ex-county employee who once worked in the zoning office. He had left abruptly after what he called moral conflicts. With enough incentive and a promise of legal anonymity, he met Thomas and Geneva in a diner 2 towns over. "I watched them do it," Caleb confessed. "They held a vote with no public notice, claimed the land was in transition, and used a development clause from 1974. But those documents, the ones with your name?" Beverly had them pre-signed. She said if anyone challenged it, they'd settle out of court. "Who signed for me?" Thomas asked. Caleb hesitated. "A guy named Marcus Whiteley. He's a notary on their payroll. Swears in anyone they need. He even used your old driver's license photo. Said it would hold up just long enough." Thomas felt his jaw clench. "How do I find this Marcus?" Geneva had already pulled his address from a licensing database. "We're 2 steps ahead of him." But even as they gathered proof of corruption, emails, deposit slips, sworn affidavits, Thomas knew it wouldn't be enough. Fraud was hard to prove in court when everyone involved wore a suit. Developers had lawyers on retainer. HOA board members had insurance protections. And the county had political cover. So Thomas changed tactics. If they had used the system to steal his land, he would use the system to build a trap. For Thomas Granger, the turning point wasn't the day he discovered the fraud. It wasn't even the day he uncovered how deeply the corruption ran through the HOA, the county office, and the developers. The true turning point was the morning he walked into the Pine Ridge County Courthouse not as a victim but as a plaintiff. Wearing his old denim jacket, a clean pair of jeans, and boots that had seen decades of honest labor, Thomas looked out of place among the polished suits and leather briefcases of the attorneys lining the court's hallways. But when he handed the court clerk his thick legal filing, 147 pages of notarized exhibits, sworn affidavits, and formal charges, it was as if the scales of justice tipped ever so slightly in his favor. "Who's your attorney?" the clerk asked, surprised by the bulk of the file. "I am," Thomas replied. And it was true, technically. Geneva Rook, his investigator-turned-legal consultant, had helped him draft the filing. But the court documents bore his name. His words. His fight. The lawsuit named not just the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association but each of its 7 board members individually, including Beverly Keene. It named the developer, Valley Ridge Partners, and its 2 primary executives. It named Marcus Whiteley, the fraudulent notary, and even listed the county zoning officer, Harold McIntyre, who had signed off on the annexation order. The charges? Fraud. Criminal conspiracy. Unauthorized land seizure. Forgery. Violations of due process. Abuse of zoning ordinances. It hit like a thunderclap. Within 48 hours, the court froze the HOA's operating accounts pending review of the fraud claims. The developers received a cease and desist order halting all further construction. The county zoning board, now under scrutiny, quietly suspended Harold McIntyre. Even Marcus Whiteley, the notary, vanished from his listed address overnight. Rumors swirled. Some said he fled to Mexico. Others said he was holed up in a cousin's garage in Florida waiting for the storm to pass. But Thomas wasn't waiting. He was just getting started. With the lawsuit gaining media attention, the narrative shifted. For months, the story had been about a proud new subdivision in the Hills Valley Haven Estates, a model of suburban luxury nestled in the wilderness. But now the headlines changed. Local rancher claims HOA stole 1,500 acres. Forged signatures spark legal firestorm. Billion-dollar development under investigation. TV crews camped outside the courthouse. National news anchors interviewed homeowners who now discovered the property they bought might have been built on stolen ground. Social media lit up with hashtags, #GrangerJustice, #LandBack, #HOA fraud. It wasn't just a legal battle now. It was a war of public opinion, and Thomas was winning. Geneva coordinated with a team of pro bono attorneys who offered to handle the courtroom proceedings in exchange for exposure. She vetted each one, ensuring none had ties to the developers or the local political machine. Meanwhile, Thomas focused on something even more powerful than the courtroom control. He reviewed his land deeds. Long before the fraudulent annexation, his family had granted limited access rights to the county and to utility companies' easements for water lines, electrical poles, and roadways. But here was the catch: they were conditional easements designed to revert back under private control if the land use changed without the owner's consent. And legally speaking, Thomas had never consented to the annexation. So, while the courts untangled the fraud, Thomas filed a series of notices through his attorneys, access revoked. Effective immediately. The HOA board didn't take him seriously at first. They thought the lawsuit was a scare tactic. But when crews showed up to lay cable and found Thomas had fenced off the right-of-way, they panicked. When he shut the gate on the main road installed decades ago as a temporary public route across his southern pasture, they called the sheriff. But the sheriff had already seen the court orders. And he wasn't about to violate a standing injunction. "They've got 30 homes in that development, Thomas," the sheriff warned him one day over coffee. "You cut off access, it's gonna get ugly." "I didn't cut it off," Thomas replied calmly. "They did. The moment they built their homes on land they didn't own. Power outages followed. Then waterline disruptions. Because Thomas's land sat beneath almost all of the development's infrastructure, and each pipe and cable crossed territory that now had legal protections in his favor. He wasn't sabotaging anything. He was exercising property rights the HOA had never thought to respect. When the first families found their water shut off, the HOA scrambled to negotiate. Beverly Keene, facing personal liability and growing outrage from homeowners, sent Thomas a formal letter requesting temporary reinstatement of easements in the interest of community well-being. He sent back a single page with one sentence: "Community well-being starts with honest land transactions." The HOA sued him in response, claiming he was holding the neighborhood hostage. But their case collapsed when the court reviewed the original deeds and confirmed the reversion clauses. The judge issued a firm ruling. Until ownership was legally resolved, Thomas had every right to control his land, including the utility easements. That broke the dam. Desperate and angry, homeowners began turning on the HOA. Dozens of them showed up at HOA meetings demanding answers. Some picketed in front of Beverly's home. Others threatened to sue the HOA board for misleading them about the legality of their property. And then Thomas made his move. Through a legal trust, he began offering to buy back the homes for half their market value. The offer was clear and cold. Sell your home back to the landowner for 50% of your purchase price, and he would waive any claims related to utility rights, easements, or occupancy. The HOA warned residents not to take the deal, calling it extortion. But Thomas wasn't breaking any law. He was offering relief, expensive, painful relief, but relief nonetheless. The first to accept were the retirees. They had sunk their savings into what they thought was their dream home. Now, facing lawsuits, water outages, and the looming fear of foreclosure, they cut their losses. Then came the single parents, the young couples, the families whose mortgage lenders had flagged the legal battle and threatened to cancel financing. One by one, they folded. Each sale was quiet, discreet. Within 6 months, Thomas legally owned 23 of the 30 homes built on land that had once belonged to him. He didn't burn them. He didn't evict anyone. He simply reclaimed. The last of the survey flags came down on a rainy morning in early October. Thomas Granger stood on the southern ridge of his property, boots half sunk in soft clay, watching as a backhoe clawed through the skeletal remains of another unfinished luxury home. The structure groaned like a dying animal, beams snapping, drywall crumbling, glass shattering in bursts that sent sparrows fluttering from nearby trees. It should have felt like vengeance, but to Thomas, it felt like pruning a diseased branch from a beloved tree. Necessary. Sad. Cleansing. Nearly a year had passed since he filed the lawsuit that cracked the Pine Ridge HOA wide open. 12 months since the mask of suburban respectability had slipped off and revealed the rotting face of corruption beneath. The court cases had crawled forward with their usual glacial pace, but the results had been swift and irrevocable once the first domino fell. It started with Beverly Keene. The day of her sentencing, the courthouse had been packed. News vans lined the street, reporters filing live segments from the front steps, while residents whispered and argued in the gallery. Thomas sat in the back, hands folded on his lap, his cowboy hat resting on the bench beside him. He listened without expression as the judge detailed the charges. Forgery, racketeering, wire fraud, falsifying public records, and criminal conspiracy. Beverly didn't cry. She didn't beg for leniency. She wore a tight gray suit and held her head high, but her eyes were empty. Her lawyer argued for probation, claimed she had only followed legal advice, that she had acted in the best interests of the HOA. But the judge wasn't swayed. "You weaponized the law to commit theft," the judge said sternly. "You manipulated the trust of a community, falsified records, and tried to destroy the legacy of a family who had lived on that land for generations." Then came the sentence, 12 years in state prison. Thomas didn't blink. He didn't need revenge. He needed accountability. And now he had it. But Beverly wasn't the only one to fall. The developer Valley Ridge Partners faced separate federal charges. Their top executives were caught funneling bribes to local officials, including the disgraced zoning officer Harold McIntyre, who fled the state and was later arrested in Arizona under an alias. The company was fined millions in restitution and lost its development licenses in 3 states. Their assets were frozen, their projects halted. Bankruptcy followed. So did civil suits. The HOA itself was dissolved under a court order. Its board members were banned from holding public office or corporate governance positions for 10 years. A court-appointed receiver took over the HOA's remaining assets, which were used to compensate defrauded homeowners who had remained trapped in the Valley Haven debacle. Thomas reclaimed the rest of his land, inch by inch, title by title. Some homes he bought directly. Others were surrendered by owners who simply walked away, unable to reconcile the nightmare their dream homes had become. A few tried to fight him in court, but they lost. His ownership claims were ironclad, his deeds authentic, his patience limitless. Now, as the machines tore down what remained of that ill-fated neighborhood, Thomas could finally breathe. But he didn't celebrate. Instead, he walked the land. He started at the northern border, old cedar groves planted by his grandfather, still standing tall despite decades of storms. He visited the family cemetery, clearing weeds from the wrought iron fence and brushing dirt off the nameplates that read Granger. He followed the creek that once provided water to his great-uncle's cattle, its banks swollen from autumn rains. Everywhere he went, he saw pieces of himself, not in monuments or memories, but in the living land. And he began to restore. The houses that had been built without his consent, those that could be salvaged, were repurposed. A few were offered to nonprofits for transitional housing. Others were converted into ranger outposts and education centers. But most, especially those half-built shells left abandoned by the developers, were torn down and returned to soil. Where driveways had cut through meadows, he planted native grasses. Where PVC pipes had broken the earth, he laid down compost and re-wilded the terrain. Within months, deer had returned to graze, and songbirds nested in newly planted saplings. But his most controversial decision wasn't what he destroyed. It was what he opened. Thomas shocked the town when he announced that large portions of his restored land, nearly 600 acres, would be open to the public. Not for development, not for profit, but for walking, learning, respect. He made no speeches. No Facebook pages or press releases. Just a hand-painted sign nailed to a cedar post at the main trailhead. Welcome to Granger Land. No fences. No fees. No tolerance for disrespect. Pick up your trash. Leave what you find. Ask before you take. This land remembers. So do I. At first, people were skeptical. They remembered the headlines, the lawsuits, the bitter battle between rancher and HOA. But slowly they came. A teacher from the elementary school brought her fifth graders to study the creek. A group of high school volunteers helped plant wildflowers along the old cattle path. Church groups cleaned up brush. Parents brought their kids to see frogs and foxes. And through it all, Thomas watched from a distance, not as a land baron or a guardian, but as a witness. When reporters tried to paint him as a hero, he refused interviews. This wasn't about revenge, he said once to Geneva. It was about putting things back the way they were, or at least as close as they could be. Geneva had stayed in Pine Ridge long after the case was over. She'd bought a small cottage just outside town and taken up a quiet consulting practice. Some said she and Thomas had grown close, neither confirmed nor denied. But Geneva understood him in a way few did. One night, over coffee on the porch, she asked the question others whispered about. Why not rebuild? You could develop the land yourself. Legally this time. Profit from it. Thomas shook his head slowly. Because not everything has to be built. Some things just need to be. My grandfather didn't fence in this land to keep people out. He did it to keep it together. If I build anything now, it's fences in people's minds. I don't want that. She smiled. You know they'll make you a folk legend, right? I'm just a man with boots and a memory, he said. Legends are for stories. This is real.